Today, we will be talking about the European conquest, which brought about some deadly diseases and how the spread of these diseases ravaged the lives of indigenous people across the globe. It is quite pathetic that in Americas, the arrival of Europeans brought disease, war, and slavery to many indigenous people. The continent of Africa was not left out of these catastrophes. We are talking about Africa. Even though this topic is not very popular in our contemporary African society, history tells us that the European brought different diseases that led to the demise of millions of people and indigenous species. Towards the end of the 19th century and the early parts of the 20th century, as the Europeans colonized more countries, Africans experienced increased famine and diseases. Prior to the advent of the Europeans, many African states had mastered their environment and the spread of diseases was relatively under control. Early contact with the European traders and missionaries introduced diseases that devastated local African tribes. First of all, the introduction of slave trade in East Africa produced new settlement partners. More people began to live in close proximity for security reasons due to their fears of slave raiders. As a result, 200,000 people died of sleeping sickness around Lake Victoria. When the disease spread to Lake Tanganyika and eventually Zambia in the Congo, it had disastrous consequences for the local populations. In the 1880s, Italian traders introduced the cattle disease rinderpest, which devastated areas in Tanzania, Kenya, Malawi, Zambia, and South Africa in the early 1890s. These diseases killed up to 90% of the cattle in parts of Central and Eastern Africa. The devastation occurred while Europeans were colonizing Africa, leaving them weak and unable to resist the early occupation by white settlers. More contact with European slave traders and settlers led to the introduction of smallpox and jingers. In addition, Europeans also introduced cholera, yellow fever, and meningitis. Some believed that Europeans deliberately introduced these diseases to make it easier to subdue the local people. It is important to note that the deliberate attempt to colonize Africa had devastating effects on the land and people. Colonial warfare also led to the large-scale destruction of villages, casualties, and famines. In the German effort to suppress the Herero in Namibia, for instance, it is estimated that about 80,000 were killed and only 15,000 survived. Due to the breakdown of traditional agriculture methods and economic systems, the regions of Ethiopia, Sudan, and Kenya experienced famine in the 1880s and 1890s. However, the Europeans viewed this process as necessary for civilizing Africans. Sadly, hunger and disease became the dominant stereotypes of Africa among Europeans. African population dropped dramatically between the late 1800s and the early 1900s. For example, the Belgian Congo's population dropped about 50% between 1880 and 1920. This crisis left many Africans weak and vulnerable. Like the experience of Africa, Latin America, and the Pacific, the entire culture and people were almost wiped out by diseases brought to their shores by Europeans and the outsiders. Let's look at the indigenous people called the Maya. The Maya epidemic, accidentally introduced by the Spanish, included smallpox, measles, and influenza. These diseases, together with typhus and yellow fever, had an impact on the Maya populations. It is estimated that 90% of the indigenous people of the Maya had been eliminated by the disease within the first century of European contact. A single soldier arriving in Mexico in 1520 was carrying smallpox, initiating the devastating plagues that swept through the native populations. Maya written histories suggest that smallpox was rapidly transmitted throughout the Maya area, the same year that it arrived central Mexico. Modern knowledge of the impact of these diseases on populations with no prior exposure suggests that 33 to 50% of the population of the Maya highlanders perished. These diseases swept through the Yachuan people in 1520s and 1530s, with periodic reoccurrence throughout the 16th century. By the late 16th century, malaria had arrived the region, and the yellow fever was first reported in the mid-17th century. Mortality was high, with approximately 50% of the Yuchian Maya settlement being wiped out. Those areas of the peninsula that experienced damper conditions became rapidly depopulated after the conquest with the introduction of malaria and the waterborne parasites. The native population of the northeastern portion of the peninsula was almost completely eliminated within 50 years of the conquest. In the south, conditions conducive to the spread of malaria existed throughout Petén and Belize. In Tabasco, the population of approximately 30,000 was reduced by an estimated 90%, with measles, smallpox, catarrh, dysentery, and fevers being the main culprits. At the time of the fall of Nochpeten in 1697, there were estimated to have been 60,000 Maya living around the Lake Petenitsa, including many refugees from other areas. It is estimated that 88% of them died during the first 10 years of the colonial rule, owing to the combination of diseases and war. Indeed, it is a sad story that a whole indigenous people perished due to these diseases brought by the Europeans. However, that is not all. Let us look at the Aztec indigenous people. The Aztec indigenous people supposedly underwent a mass spread of smallpox from September to November 1520. This is important because the Aztec lacked stable leadership during the Spanish conquest of the Tenochtitlans since their leaders died. Regardless, the spread of smallpox throughout Tenochtitlans severely weakened the Aztec people and aided the Spanish in their final battle against the city. On top of this, the native disease named Cuculitzi by the Aztec led to the death of millions of people. The disease stoned several times, baffling native and Spanish doctors. Symptoms included high fever, black tongue, dark urine, dysentery, severe abdominal and chest pain, head and neck nodules, neurological disorder, jaundice, and profuse bleeding from the nose, eyes, and mouth. It's usually killed within 3 to 4 days, leading to 5.15 million estimated deaths. Moving on, let's see how the diseases also affected the indigenous people of the Inca. The collapse of the Inca Empire started when the Spaniards arrived to Central America and transmitted their diseases to locals, who spread them to other parts of the continent, including South America. It is believed that in the 10 years, between 50% and 90% of the population was attacked by these same diseases. Smallpox, influenza, typhus, diarrhea, chickenpox, and measles. Disease spread alarmingly fast as the Amerindians did not have the immunity to fight off newly brought viruses. They affected not only the working class but also the nobility. As a result, disease weakened the working class, resulting in lower agricultural output, and the effectiveness of the communication network was the backbone of the empire's success. Now, we are moving on to the Australian Aborigines and how these diseases affected them. At the time of the first European contact, many estimates have suggested between 315,000 and 750,000 people lived in Australia in diverse groups. Still, upper estimates place the total population as high as 1.25 million. A cumulative population of 1.6 billion indigenous people has been estimated to have lived in Australia over 65,000 years prior to the British colonization. In the early 1900s, it was commonly believed that Australia's Aboriginal population was leading towards extinction. The population shrank from those present when colonization began in New South Wales in 1788 to only 50,000 in 1930. This drastic reduction of this indigenous population has been attributed to the outbreaks of smallpox and other diseases to which the indigenous people had no immunity. Still, other sources have described the extent of frontier clashes and, in some cases, deliberate killings of Aboriginal people. Deadly infectious diseases like smallpox, influenza, and tuberculosis were a major cause of the Aboriginal death. Smallpox alone ravaged more than 50% of the Aboriginal population. In April 1789, a major outbreak of smallpox killed a large number of indigenous Australians between Hawkesbury River, Broken Bay, and Port Hawkins. Based on information recorded in the journals of some members of the First Fleet, the Aborigines of the Sydney region had never encountered the disease and lacked immunity to it. These diseases went further to affect the Pacific Islands. In 1826, almost 2,000 people lived on the Pacific island of Rapaiti, but 40 years later, fewer than 120 survived. On Rapuanu, there were 3,000 people in 1862, yet within 10 years, only 175 were left. There were many aspects to this ecological imperialism. The venereal disease was left behind whenever a ship landed, and possibly most devastating of all, explorers spread tuberculosis throughout islands. Europeans also brought new animal parasites, including fleas and bacterial, fungal, and viral infections. In conclusion, undoubtedly, the introduction of foreign diseases, including chickenpox, measles, flu, and venereal diseases, had a disastrous impact on the various indigenous territories across the globe. Not just in the early contact period, but throughout the 19th century and early 20th century. It contributed to a sudden and catastrophic decline in population, accompanied by the abandonment of agricultural system following the introduction of European diseases. And that's it for the show today on the European conquest. I hope you enjoyed the show. I hope it is quite revealing because it has never been told before. Thanks for watching Nebo TV. Do not forget to smash the subscription button, notification bell, like, and share this video to your loved ones. My name remains Onome Agbaje. See you next time.